That you're all awake to listen to the papers we're going to have in this session. This session is entitled Biopolitical Perspectives. Yesterday we had a pre-workshop conversation, and Andrew said something interesting about, in the question of climate change and migration, the interesting question to ask ourselves is, where does the political lie? And I think with biopolitical perspectives, we're going to just search for that. So we're going to have 3 papers this morning in this session. First, Giovanni Bettini, who is a young doctor. He defended his thesis in sustainability science at the Lund University, and it's entitled Climate on the Moves, Climate-Induced Migration and the Politics of Environmental Discourse. So he's going to present a paper that is based on his thesis, and he will talk to us about climate migration as adaptation, de-securitising climate migration, or making the unruly governable. Then Andrew is going to read Julian Reed's paper. So Julian Reed is from the University of Lapland, and he's a professor of international relations. He has an interest in biopolitics, and he has applied it to questions such as war, security, peace, or development. And then finally, we're going to have Aaron Sogana from Lancaster University that has an interest in race. He's going to, he has published several papers on racial questions, and he's going to present a paper on climate change as biopolitical assemblage, how global capitalism produces racial difference. So without further ado, I'm going to let Giovanni start.
Good morning, everybody. I am Giovanni Bettini, and I don't have to introduce myself. Father, thank you very much for the quick and brief picture of me, Emily. And what I'll try to do in the coming, let's say, less than 20 minutes is to somehow provide a vista on the debate on climate-induced migration through, somehow with an historical perspective and with biopolitics as the main kind of guiding analytic. And what I'll try to show is my idea that when looking at the debate on climate migration, so I'll call it climate migration for briefness sake, you can identify 2 registers or 2 phases, and we'll go through quickly the main traits of the 2 phases, and then I'll discuss the degree to which these 2 phases in the debate are heterogeneous, and by applying quite quickly a biopolitical analytical, we'll try to show that these 2 phases in the debate, and we'll get to know about them very soon, are less heterogeneous than what is most often assumed in nowadays conversations and debates and policy interactions on climate migration. And I would like to point out before I start that in this presentation I'll kind of hopefully give a few background pictures for the discussion, and as you'll notice I won't dig deeply into ticklish issues such as the exact ways in which these courses on climate migration racialize the issue, and I won't even make explicit reference, for instance, to the dimensions or the articulations of the discourses that make the very discourses very much class related. But I just want to say this in order to be open about the fact that it's, I have to say, it's something I keep in the background for kind of other presentations, and I hope that without digging deep into that, I'll manage to even just show in some pictures highlight how race, class, and temporalities are crucial, often unsaid ingredients of the discourses and the debates on climate and migration. So, how to begin from the beginning? The very debate about climate change-induced migration is about movement. One is the movement of climates that are changing, and the debates about changing climates. One is another ticklish issue and vivid and politically contentious debate, and that's the one about people moving. And here we say like insights on the racial or at least colonial connotations of the debates, but still it's a big debate and connected to many problematic but very salient political signifiers, such as development, for instance. So when you take the two debates and you explore the ways in which changing climates will influence human mobility, then you get this strange debate on climate change and migration, and that is articulated in different ways, as we will see, but has to do quite much with, I would say, the struggle to signify socially the pressing questions that are created by human impacts on climate change and environmental degradation, at least at face value, because if that is true, that the debate comes from the struggle to signify these kind of environmental impacts on human societies, I would claim that it's also true that it's also the other way around, so a climatization of social relations in a way. And against this background, when kind of getting closer to the very debates on climate migration, I think that I would like to signal that we should all probably be a bit suspicious about the emphasis that is put on the alleged novelty of this topic. If you, for instance, as Andrew was telling us, climate migration has become a salient issue for policy and politics within the UNFCCC context. And if you read the paragraph where this issue is formally introduced for one of the first times in the UNFCCC context, it really smells novelty. This is a new issue. We have to create new knowledge, and we have to find new policy instruments for dealing with this and so on, and it's kind of a symptom of an assumption that is crossed throughout the debate, I would say, so the novelty. But in a way, I think, is that so new? I guess that most of you here agree on this, but it's not the case in the mainstream interventions in the debate. And I think that it's quite revealing to have a quick look at the origins of the concept of climate refugees or environmental refugees, climate migration, environmental migration. And you see that they might be novel to a certain extent, but on the one hand, they have very clearly situated roots in the environmentalist discourses of the 70s. Because in the present format, or with the present ingredients, climate migration has been pushed by actors such as the UNEP, representatives of these northern mainstream environmentalist discourses of the 70s. And once you accept this, then you get even more suspicious, because if you consider how environmentalist mainstream discourses or sustainable development discourses and so on, the way in which the connection between environmental degradation and change and population, the way it has been signified within these discourses is quite problematic. And I would say that you could even go even longer back and say that the core of the debate on climate migration is in the quarrel between Malthus and Marx, I would say. since these courses on sustainable development and environmentalism have signified the nexus between population and environment, basically by identifying some sort of surplus population a la Malthus. So if that's the kind of, if these are the roots of the debate on climate and migration, I guess that some suspiciousness is more than justified. And I think that now that I'll go through the two main phases or registers in the debate since the 90s, let's say, you'll see different articulations of the same or very similar concerns about these surplus populations, which is relevant per se, and also which probably gives entry points for a discussion about the very repressed question of how race, for instance, enters the concepts and discourses that emerge about climate and migration. So if we consider now the two main registers in the debate, I think that you can see the question of climate migration and even environmental migration emerging and getting saliency through a series of apocalyptic narratives that have been central in the debates until, I would say, at least the middle of the 2000s. With climate migration becoming something to care about, so becoming basically an object for research and for politics, signified as the threat of these incredibly huge and abrupt waves of climate refugees mounting from the developed world, threatening or pushing at the gates of affluent countries. So, I mean, I'm here, probably those in the back can't read it, but I'm just taking up a few titles of some reports, like The Human Tsunami on Financial Times, Here Comes the Flood, a UN-related report, The Human Tide, an article in a peer-reviewed journal, and then here's some pictures, I mean, of the waves, and looking closer at this because it's one more symptom of racialization. This is a kind of a work of art presented in London a couple of years ago, I think, or 3 years ago now, about future climates, and you see Buckingham Palace surrounded by a refugee camp. So climate refugees putting the siege on the kind of the core of global capital. So with the idea that you have this dangerous population that because of their vulnerability and because of the impacts of climate change will be uprooted abruptly and will move in waves and tides towards affluent societies. And this has been basically the leading conceptualization of the topic that has been popularized even by Stern Review, for instance, and even many humanitarian or environmental organizations have been pushing on this kind of framing until quite recently. And I mean, this kind of apocalyptic or catastrophe mindset mobilized in the debate have been criticized quite extensively in the debate, and given that most of you are familiar with the debate, I won't go so deeply into this. I mean, people have been saying, look, I can understand that you mobilize these crisis narratives for attracting attention, but it's not all the time so that mobilizing a crisis narrative leads to action or attention. And then other people have pointed out how this crisis narrative, when mobilized about migration, tend to reinforce xenophobic narratives and even be conducive to possibly to a securitization of climate migration. And then I would say that another interesting area on which I've focused more, but I'll just briefly touch upon here, is the fact that there are specific temporalities, as Andrew had, like a set of very strong tones, very strongly connected to security and the idea of the impacts of climate change becoming security threats. And then you also had very openly racialized pictures and imaginaries mobilized. This unruly and disordered population from the south forming waves of threatening climate refugees that will knock at the gates of affluent societies. And I'm just signaling that this has been a very prominent register in the debate, and that has occupied most of the debate of the discussion in the field of climate-induced migration. So people against or pro the concept of climate refugees, so with skeptics and alarmists, if you want to follow the standard classification of the two positions in the debate, and to a certain extent it's still there. But I would claim that quite recently you could see the immersion of a slightly different register, actually. A register that is more mundane, that uses way softer terms, and that is able to welcome a broader set of positions. Here I'm just showing a few pictures of very influential documents that in my view show this shift from a register that you could call of the exception. So this openly scary image of waves of climate refugees to the rule, meaning something more mundane that has to do more with governance than with the apocalypse. And I'm referring, for instance, to the Foresight report published just a couple of years ago, and then to, I would say, a very revealing initiative by the Asian Development Bank that has published quite extensively on that and has been starting to even create policies, interaction among countries in Asia, and then also reports coming from the UN universities, such as the latest Where the Rain Falls, and then also the Asian Pacific Migration and Environment Network, just for signaling, I mean, very influential reports by influential actors in which the old register, so for or against this concept of climate refugees, is not that crucial or central anymore, and in which basically the idea of climate migration being an issue of security, so bad security, is replaced by the idea of climate migration being an issue of human security, so good security. And I mean, one can wonder the extent to which these two registers are heterogeneous. And in the most recent interventions in the debate, this shift of register away from climate refugees, the scary picture, gloom and gloom narratives, to a milder register that considers migration also as a possible positive adaptation strategy. This shift of register has been welcomed as an advancement or a positive development, and on the one hand it's very hard to deny that, since the very, almost shameful analytical mistakes, so to speak, if you accept this word, that were contained in the previous register focused on climate refugees are not there anymore. So basically the first part of Andrew's talk has been kind of welcomed, I would say, in the mainstream register now. So the idea that it's not possible to easily single out climate change as the cause of a certain movement has been accepted, for instance. And then also there's been an emphasis on the fact that the impacts of climate change on human migration have to be understood in the context of broader socio-economic and socio-ecological changes that are taking place. So in these interventions I showed you, there's an open reference to development, for instance, that you can't speak about climate migration without speaking also about development. So that's probably positive. Another thing that is positive, or that is kind of shows some signs of advancement is that the debate is less polarized and there's been a kind of the possibility, at least to within the academy, have a, let's call it, normal debate. And although I accept all, and these narratives embed mechanisms through which there is a selection of good flows. So the good, so at the horizon of this narrative, set of narratives or discourses, there are the adaptive subject. The adaptive subject that might become a migrant, but is a migrant that has become able and has developed the capacities and capabilities to follow the lines of force of international labor markets, for instance. It's a migrant that is possibly insurable himself or herself or through her assets. And you see a symptom of this very clearly in the fact that all the reports that push this narrative on climate migration as adaptation strategy try, when it comes to policy avenues, to push circular and temporary migration. And there is a huge body of research within critical migration studies that question the idea put forward, for instance, by the UNDP or the World Bank, that this kind of migration is emancipatory for the concerned people. So that there is a huge body of research showing that basically the effect of this approach to migration is not an empowering or the freer migration for the concerned, but rather the disciplining and government of the movement of these unruly populations that are still unsignified from within, let's say the constellation of relations that we call neoliberalism. And you see that these populations concerned by the discourses on climate migration are really at the fringes of global capital. At the fringes both geographically and in terms of their subjectivities and their fit to the extent to which they are fit to the neoliberal rule. So basically what I'm saying is that in both cases you have the identification of dangerous populations, of the threat. In the first case, so when talking about climate refugees, they are at the center of the stage, right on the table, the threat, climate refugees. While in the emerging register, they are kept in the background because the focus is on the positive, so the sources of positive circulations and the sources of those who are adapted and adaptable. But I think that still, as shown by, for instance, Julian Reed or Mark Duffield, you see that even this kind of positive emphasis on human security and the connection between human security and development, even those articulations of these courses entail a triage, that is the separation of the fit versus the unfit. And it's also, it should also be noted that this separation or triage implies the exercise of brutal force and violence. So that I think, simplifying to the bone, what I'm trying to argue is that both registers or phases in the debate are the kind of two sides of the same biopolitical coin or biopolitical project that has to do with the attempt to render disordered populations at the fringes of global capital governable, to produce subjectivities that are fit to the neoliberal rule, and that the two registers are kind of different strategies that concern different symptoms, if you like, but at the end of the day are based on the very same, or are heading towards the very same neoliberal biopolitical horizon. And I think I have really to stop here. Thank you very much.